we know very, very little about citizen views, particularly on the U.S. side. We know actually more about the Mexican side because we tend to have people supporting survey research in Mexico that actually has assessed those views. To me, the most significant view on the Mexican side about the U.S. side, which is sort of incorporates many of the issues that we've talked about, is the extraordinary drop in respect for the United States. Again, in my professional lifetime, I've never seen a lower incidence of support for the United States. In fact, the negative views of ordinary Mexican citizens exceeds the positive views, which are down to a level of somewhere around 25 to 30%. That's a huge gap that somehow needs to be overcome. I have no idea whether the inauguration of Obama has actually changed that. I doubt if it's changed it very significantly. On the U.S. side, as I said, we know even less. The most recent view I've seen of anything related to public policy issues between the two countries was an excellent Pew study of attitudes towards immigration of the 5 states which have the largest immigration issues present in those societies. And in all 5 of those states, including Arizona where it's most contentious, about a 2/3 majority on average favored immigration reform, and in the state of Arizona it was barely a simple majority. So there's a huge gap that has to be addressed on the citizen perspective as distinct from the elite perspective, and don't confuse the elite perspective with the citizen perspective would be my overall advice.
And how has the elite perspective evolved since the NAFTA honeymoon 15 years ago?
Well, I think I would agree with the qualitative assessment that there is more optimism, but like Susan and others, I'm actually not that optimistic. I don't see the optimism being justified for 2 reasons. One, as has been mentioned here, I do not think the underlying structural issues are being addressed by either country. I think the most important national security bilateral issue between the 2 countries is not drugs, it's poverty. We have done very little to address that issue in Mexico from our perspective. Mexico has made some efforts in the last 3 administrations, beginning with Zedillo, but it hasn't reduced poverty down to 40%. That's a very optimistic figure. 40 million, it's maybe reduced it down to the low 40th percentile, and that's a much larger number of individuals. The second issue is that, again, what I would reinforce is that our foreign policy towards Mexico, as our foreign policy in most areas of the world, is short-term and reactive. We have no long-term strategies. As Susan correctly said, what is our overall foreign policy towards Latin America? I don't think anybody could really identify exactly what that is. And that's unfortunate. We don't have a bipartisan long-term strategy within this country towards Mexico. And so unless we are willing to construct that kind of an underlying strategy that's long-term, which I think would be almost impossible to do given the differences between the views that you will hear in the executive branch versus the views that you will hear in Congress, I'm not really that optimistic about it.
Mexican elites?
Well, I think Mexican elites have a much more positive attitude in terms of their interactions with U.S. elites. I mean, I think if you wanted to examine this from a citizen elite view, you could mention 2 things that would affect this relationship. Education has come up a number of times. Of course, I think it's a contribution to solving the poverty issue, but it also is a contribution to bringing elites and citizens closer together. That's probably the single most important variable. From a Mexico-U.S. perspective, the most important variable is not just increasing the educational level of Mexicans who would like to work in the United States, but increasing their competency in English is by far the most important variable. That's what separates them from Asian and Philippine immigrants to the United States.
We mentioned aterrizar, and Luis de la Calle actually just did aterrizar, so please join us, Luis, up here in the panel. Yep, please. You are a panelist, Luis. So. Peter Smith, drug policy. Let's go back to that, 'cause needless to say, that's at the core of the agenda. Two things. One, any hope in terms of, as Andres Rosenthal rightly underscored, progress in drug control policies and actions in the U.S.? And two, any hope in terms of control of southbound traffic, arms and precursors and money?
Well, thank you for those very straightforward and simple questions. I've been an academic for 45 years, and I've never been the most optimistic person on a panel. This is a historic first, I think. Although I'd have to qualify that and say, on the question of southbound arms, I'm not very optimistic about that. This is a country whose Congress recently approved an amendment allowing people to carry live firearms in public parks as an amendment to a bill on credit card regulation. Now, that tells you a lot about sort of the social focus on arms and the difficulty of taking political action to regulate the sale of arms. I think clearly, you know, there's an issue. You can try to, without a really strict registration system that works, it is not going to function. There'll still be a way to buy and smuggle arms south. It might be reduced a bit, but I think the culture in this country is so favorable to the possession of arms, and what I regard as a misreading of the Second Amendment. There was a preacher who was called on his parishioners on the 4th of July as they come to worship that day to bring their firearms to church because the marriage of faith and power has been such an important part of American culture. So I'm a little cautious about that.
Where is that?
He said unloaded, though.
Where is that?
Would you want to go?
See?
Unloaded, Peter. He said unloaded.
But let me try to offer an idea about what's next. What I want to suggest is a possibility for bilateral cooperation between the United States and Mexico on drugs. It has to do with reducing demand. I would like to propose that the two governments undertake a bilateral initiative for reduction of demand for drugs in their two countries and beyond that throughout the hemisphere. I believe that Mexico is now engaged not in what I would call a drug war, but a governability war. The challenge to the Mexican government is one of political authority. Its basis is resources from drug trafficking, but it's not a drug war. It's a war to reassert the authority and the legitimacy of the rule of the Mexican government throughout the country. So let's not confuse it. It's a ferocious and extremely violent and important war within Mexico. But let's not assume that it's simply a drug war. It is not. If Mexico succeeds in driving out the cartels, the traffic will simply go elsewhere. It will go to Central America. It will go to the Caribbean. It will go wherever. The success for Mexico in its war on governability would be to export the drug traffic elsewhere throughout the hemisphere. It would not reduce demand in the United States. It would not reduce what is now growing demand within Mexico and throughout the hemisphere. It would export the traffic. It would reroute the traffic. There might be a pause and a delay, but it would basically shift the routes elsewhere. That is not a long-term success, in my view. Consumption has been growing in Mexico and in other countries of Latin America. Consumption has been growing in the United States. One of the best-kept secrets of the last 8 years is that the number of users of illicit drugs in the United States has grown from approximately 16 million in the year 2000-2001 to about 20 million in the year 2008. That is not progress. So the question of growing demand for illicit drugs continues to be with us, and is one that threatens the social fabric and the public health of both societies. Now, I would say, look, policies over the years for supply control have typically led to militarization of drug wars, different from Mexico's governability war, that do not work. What they do is tend to increase the risk in the traffic, which tends to increase the profits in the traffic. It does not reduce the traffic. It does not solve the problem. What could solve the problem would be demand reduction. Now, we have not applied policies in the United States to do so, but all the research shows that treatment, prevention, education, rehabilitation of drug users is much more effective and much more cheap than supply control. It's the most effective and efficient way to deal with the drug problem. We have not applied it in the United States, as shown by the recent figures. But we have pretty good laboratories. We know from the research what can be done and how to do it. Parenthetically, for example, it has been shown that residential treatment centers are the most effective way to rehabilitate drug users. Where do you get most drug users nowadays? You get them in jail. What better opportunity than to rehabilitate people by putting drug treatment centers in jail? Well, politically, that looks like being soft on criminals. It is our best opportunity. The best people who treat addicts are former addicts, right? There's a potential resource that could be used. That has been wasted in the United States, but the research is very clear on this. It is cheaper, it's more humane, and it's more effective, and it has not been applied. So what I want to suggest is that Mexico and the United States join together in a major initiative to reduce demand in both of their countries. This is said to be a part of the Merida Initiative, but let's be honest. You know, this Merida Initiative is not about drug reduction. It's about the governability war. And that it's simply not sort of a central part of the campaign. This is also not terribly expensive. So I want to suggest that the two governments join together in an initiative of this sort, that it could be a joint proposal, just a bilateral commitment to begin with. It could be proposed at the next Summit of the Americas to have a hemispheric reach, which would give it much more sort of analytical power, because if you simply push the drug traffic to Brazil, you haven't really solved the problem either. You simply sort of pushed it around. Or you could do it at a meeting of the recently resuscitated Organization of American States. I say recently resuscitated because it finally took action on its own in contradistinction to the wishes of at least the former U.S. government, in which, of course, our president called Lula to ask him to help solve the problem of how to deal with Cuba. So there are a number of venues. I'm not going to get into details of how you could do it. I want to suggest the spirit of the idea that this is in the interest of both countries. It is in Mexico's interest to reduce demand in Mexico and to have demand reduced in the United States. It is in our interest to have demand reduced in the United States and in Mexico and throughout the hemisphere. So this is not exactly a call for sacrifice by one country to serve the interests of another. It satisfies the question of the rhetoric of shared responsibility and moving to shared strategy. To be sure, it seems to me that notion that we have shared responsibility is very euphemistic when we're talking about the drug problem, right? It's not like it's 50-50. It's not like Mexico has half the consumers and we have the other half, right? I mean, a shared responsibility with about 90% here and 10% there. So let's be clear at least about the terms of this. But it is shared responsibility, and we could move to a joint strategy that would serve the interests of both countries and also actually provide political, geopolitical, diplomatic benefits for both countries. It would show to the hemisphere that this bilateral relationship is capable of suggesting a major measure for the benefit of the hemisphere. That these two countries can get together and do it and suggest something that could have hemispheric ramifications and be supported by countries throughout the hemisphere. And moreover, in dealing with drugs, my Lord, it would have the benefit of going to the core of the problem, to going to the base of the problem and not to the symptoms. What a revolutionary, radical thought and proposal by this pointy-headed academic from the West Coast. But I'm telling you, that's where the problem is. And why not approach the problem instead of deal with the symptoms? Now, I'm not saying we should not support Mexico in its governability war. We must. But that's a different war. Let's not confuse that with a drug war.
Peter, 30 seconds.
Let's think about, long-term possibilities here. And finally, let me just make 2 observations.
Decriminalizing. Any thoughts on that?
Thank you so much for bringing it up. You don't have, if you can really reduce demand, the debate over legalization or decriminalization goes away because there aren't so many consumers. If we can get back to the level of consumption of my youth in the 1950s, I'm not talking about zero tolerance, but let's get it back to sort of pre-1965 levels. And in that case, the great fear of legalization now is that, well, you've got 20 million users, you're going to legalize it, and it's going to grow to 60 million users, et cetera. If you reduce that to, say, 2 million users or 5 million users, it's a different discussion. Decriminalization, is a very tempting possibility because you only put the traffickers in jail and the users, can continue to loll on the beaches of Southern California. The problem with that is that it guarantees for illicit traffickers a stable market. It doesn't really deal with demand reduction. It allows people to consume without penalty while guaranteeing a market for illicit traffickers. So it sounds like a great halfway house, but I don't think it works. Let me just say this. Education, prevention, and treatment can work. I have an 11-year-old daughter at my advanced age. She came home to me the other day and said, "Daddy, guess what?" I said, "What do you mean, Amanda?" She said, "Did you know that there are 29 side effects of cocaine?" I said, "Gee, Amanda, I only knew about 28. But what I'm telling you is that, this can work. Now, not every school does this. My daughter's Amanda is very special, but it can work. You can educate people about the dangers. You can rehabilitate people if you're serious. You can treat people, and you can use former addicts as a resource to really get the problem under control, and in this sense, really serve the mutual interests of both countries and use it as an example for hemispheric governance."
Here. Okay, thank you. Luis de la Calle, let's turn into a different topic here. We've been discussing NAFTA early in tonight, and I think there's an acknowledgement in terms of how much of a quantum leap we had 15 years ago. In many ways, in terms of the relationship, in terms of how we saw each other, in terms of how Mexico saw its role in North America, etc. It's been a success in terms of what it was truly meant to accomplish in terms of trade and investment flows, etc., etc. But today, we're facing a shift in terms of paradigms. We're facing increasing pressures in terms of protectionism. We're facing trade-offs in terms of security vis-a-vis trade. We're facing the fact that there's no further appetite for regional economic integration, and we're facing the fact, despite what Jim Jones was suggesting in terms of perhaps reaching a borderless economy in 20 years, today the border is thickening. So where do we go from here? I mean, give us a roadmap as to how does NAFTA survive, number one, and go into a next stage that addresses the fundamental interest and issues on both sides?
Well, first thing I would say is that NAFTA will survive because it's a good idea. And it happens to be a trade agreement with the U.S.'s largest trading partners and neighbors. And I mean, that's when we were discussing NAFTA 15 years ago, people thought, well, why Mexico and Canada? Well, I mean, we're neighbors. No? And being neighbor has a significant challenges, but also tremendous opportunities. And the way to look forward for the trade relationship is to pose exactly the same questions we posed 15 years ago, which is why or where is the mutual benefit for the U.S. and for Mexico and also, of course, Canada in doing something together. I mean, if we try to solve NAFTA in the U.S. as it's good for Mexico, it wouldn't do any good. It wouldn't happen. It would get no support. If you try to solve NAFTA in Mexico as it's good for the U.S., it doesn't make any sense. I mean, So we have to find a common ground as to why doing things together is good for Mexico and the US. And I think that the present economic and international financial crisis is a tremendous opportunity to reshape NAFTA. Because the extent of the adjustment that will take place globally is still not really understood. The US has a current account deficit that is very large, has been large for many years, and that is the source of the crisis the US is facing. We know this in Mexico because we've gone through crises like that many times. At every turn in that sort of crisis, you have to adjust. How much? Well, if the US is going to delever, reduce your debt to GDP ratio, you have to run a current account surplus. Running current account deficits only increase the level of leverage. So the US will have to adjust its current account numbers in such a magnitude that it will end up running a current account surplus. And China, on the other side, if China wants to continue growing, will have to adjust its numbers in such a way that they reduce their massive current account surplus. Well, that means ships across the Pacific with empty containers going east and full containers going west. The US has little ability to export final goods because now the US is specialized in producing and exporting either raw materials or intermediate goods. But Mexico and the US together, we could export final goods to Asia. So the question today is, how do we structure our trading relationship in such a way that we benefit from the changing trading winds across the Pacific? Could Mexico and the US conquer together Asia? Well, I mean, then we start having a different type of dialogue with the US. And related to this is the following question, is related to GM's bankruptcy. The crisis accelerates the deindustrialization of the US. Well, which country should benefit from that process? Well, many will try, but Mexico should be number one. So now, how do Mexico profit from the deindustrialization process in the Midwest? Well, with the same recipe we tried 15 years ago successfully, which is improve your risk profile. How do you improve your risk profile in Mexico? Well, one, you have your house in order, you have macroeconomic stability, you have, answering to Peter's concern, you win that war on governability, and you establish the rule of law. But if Mexicans realize that investing in our own stability is good for our, not only in terms of justice and civility and social behavior, but also key for competitiveness, then we might look at having more security, more financial stability, and a democratic system that works with a different light. And maybe we can then be more successful in investing on those things. So I will try to sell that way the integration between Mexico and the US and Canada to Washington these days, not to New York. Decisions are not taken in New York anymore, but to the auto sector and the financial sector in DC. That there is an opportunity. I mean, even in the midst of turbulence, there is an opportunity to better integrate Mexico and the U.S. And I think it's for Mexico to propose it. And of course, I mean, you can then try to do more specific things in terms of international trade and investment. But it makes it basically what we have to do on the Mexican side is to undertake the final steps in terms of our trade opening, which is unilateral trade opening. Mexico should not engage in a negotiation to completely open its economy, but actually do it on its own and show that with that action, show to the U.S. and Canada that Mexico is ready to together try to conquer the Asian markets.
Is that politically feasible?
I think it is. If you pose the question to Mexican people, they will say yes. If you pose the question to 20 members of Congress in Mexico, they will say no. As in the U.S., we have in that aspect full NAFTA convergence.
Yes, absolutely.
So I mean, it's a matter of how you present it. And one more thing, if you want to succeed in the governability war, the best thing you can do beyond cooperation with the U.S., which is very important, is to reduce the size of the illegal markets. Well, how do you do that? How do you reduce the size of the illegal markets? Well, it's very simple. Lower import duties against Chinese products to zero. And half of the illegal markets in Mexico will disappear. And with that, half of the market for the illegal unorganized crime, illegal activity and organized crime will disappear with it. So instead of buying Chinese products on Corregidora Avenue between the Supreme Court and the President's office, you will buy them in Walmart. And that's good for the U.S. and good for Mexico.
Any follow-up comments before I open to the others? No? We're all happy?
Give the audience a chance.
The audience, yeah.
Okay. Questions? Sydney. Oh, I'm sorry. MC. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is David Eaton. I'm a graduate student. We have addressed it in bits and pieces, but nobody's really talked the midterm elections that are going to happen in Mexico. Or, did you guys hear that, or do you want me to say that again?
No,
or the possibility of another alternation, after Calderon. The PRI is growing in the polls right now, and they might gain a majority. Or does anybody want to talk about the PRI might regaining the presidency in 2012, and then the possibility of U.S. future relations at that point?
Rosana, Rod? Yeah.
This is the moment where I talk about what we're doing at cnnexpansion.com. There's something called Central Electoral, and there's an interview today as we speak. I taped this Friday with Beatriz Paredes. The polls are consistent so far, but the gap is closing. The PRI is certainly going to be in a better position than they were in 2006, which is not that big a deal because they were the third, a distant third, by the way. But they, in the course of these years, the PRD made itself a favor with their internal divisions and make us forget that was the case. They're going to go back to being the second force. But there's one poll, GEAISA, which is there in centralelectoral.com, which is a kind of real clear politics approach to how we cover the election, that says that the PAN is ahead. We're talking about the fact that the midterm elections are not going to give President Calderon what every president dreams about, which is control of, within his party, control of the legislative forces. But the opposition within the PRI has been a loyal opposition, and what we're going to see is 3 more years of the PRI-PAN tango about what they can really do, and they're going to see that each party, and now I'm not talking about the 3 leading parties, but every party, and that includes Convergencia and PT, which now are the party where Mr. López Obrador is regaining his force. Every party will have to prepare for the presidential elections. And there are people saying that we already have the candidates clear and present for the presidential election. I don't think that that is the case. I think that there are other faces, names, family names that will and can eventually get into the competition.
Rod?
What I would add to that is this reminds me a lot of what happened in 2003, that is the midterm elections under Fox. I think Rosanna is right that the gap is closing, but let's just assume that PRI wins. I think the only issue there is whether PRI would actually win enough seats to have a majority or whether it will have to form an alliance. The other real significant issue is, will PRI behave in the same way that it did in 2003, and instead of working to negotiate alliances with one or the other parties, it basically conducted a strategy of providing an obstacle to any significant legislation getting through. So if it does that, it's basically going to make it nearly impossible for the executive branch to function effectively, and that, I think, could be a very serious issue. And I think what that also suggests is that PRI would make it more difficult for itself and whatever candidate it chooses to run to win that election. Overall, the most important thing, I think, to keep in mind is that all Mexicans have a very low appreciation for all three parties. The confidence in political parties in Mexico is somewhere around 20 to 25%. So, and it doesn't make any difference which party it is. That has been true for some time. That hasn't changed. The other thing I might say is that this rise of the PRI and the decline of the PAN in, as far as the congressional elections are concerned, is a change that's occurred over just 5 months. In December, PAN was well ahead of PRI in the preference polls. In the most recent poll that was done about 6 or 8 weeks ago, people were asked, if you were voting for president today, who would you vote for? PRI was significantly ahead of both of the other parties. But this is much, much too far ahead to actually make any predictions, because I think PRI is likely to shoot itself in the foot once again, as it did in 2003.
Rosanna?
There's one thing that you should be watching if you're following that, el voto nulo. That is a growing movement, especially between the young people, that are saying that you should go to the poll and basically
nullify,
destroy your vote. Either cross the whole thing or put a legend there saying that, like the Argentinians did, que se vayan todos, no?
A poll just 3 or 4 days ago, 10% said they were going to do that.
Another question. Yes, sir.
My name is Joe Dukert. I'm an independent energy analyst. And I'd like to propose an answer to a question that was raised in the second panel and alluded to in this one. The question was, how does one convert shared responsibility to shared strategy? And I suggest the way to do that is one strategy at a time, observing targets of opportunity in respect to the current time. Now, Peter Smith suggested that one strategy that might work would be something that had to do with reduction of demand for drugs, and Luis de la Calle referred to a selective regional trade strategy. I'd like to propose a third, which I think is most propitious at this time, and it goes back to something Diana Negroponte mentioned almost in passing. We've heard pronouncements about 2 bilateral efforts in respect to climate change. Canada and the United States and Mexico. I think there may even have been a pronouncement about cooperation between Canada and Mexico, but never North American cooperation. The leaders at the summit in August are not going to adopt a strategy because we ask them to, or even because it's the best strategy. I think they will, if they adopt a common strategy, it will be one that appeals to all three. And even though none of the 3 countries has a solution to the climate change problem, I really think the time is ripe for a possible climate change strategy for North America. I'm not going to go into more detail and take more time, but it makes a lot of sense. It would involve renewable energy partnerships, protection of competitiveness, use of natural gas, a lot of things that just make sense.
Diana, do you want to comment on that? Diana?
No, I don't think
Okay. Well,
Well, I think it's a very useful suggestion, and one issue that hasn't come up here, which you're sort of stimulating me to mention, is it's been mentioned a couple of times, the H1N1 virus. But what I'd like to stress is that it seems to me that one of the most significant bilateral policy issues is actually the potential for a pandemic, which we've seen evident in what's happened in the last couple of months. I participated in a scenario game-playing exercise that was sponsored by the State Department, the Defense Department, and Homeland Security, with the Defense Department in Mexico significantly missing just 12 months ago. This goes back to a point that an earlier commentator made about this has been a 4-year effort. The scariest possible situation that I'm aware of as a Mexicanist is the likelihood of that actually occurring. So it seems to me that if we want to really address a security issue that has a much greater potential of actually occurring, is addressing that issue where there already is a lot of willingness to cooperate, but the U.S. has not committed resources to helping Mexico create its potential to carry out its side of that responsibility as an overall strategy. And I'll just mention one example. The genetic decoders which were used to try to identify what this strain of virus was were missing in Mexico. Mexico didn't have those decoders. I discovered that they cost $30,000 a piece. This is a minuscule amount of money compared to what we're spending, for example, on the interdiction strategy for drugs. So it seems to me that your idea, I think this idea, which has really significant potential pragmatic results as soon as possibly this fall, when this virus is likely to reemerge where we don't know. And by the way, this virus did not just start in Mexico, it started in San Diego.
2 cases.
I think it's something that we really need to talk about.
Ambassador Jones.
I would just like to ask about Susan's critique that we do not have a foreign policy vis-a-vis Mexico or a foreign policy vis-a-vis Latin America. If you were asked to write that foreign policy for Mexico and Latin America, what would it be?
Well, frankly, I think a lot of the aspects of our older policy was good in terms of support for democracy, for democratic government, support for free trade and free trade agreements. If you can't get the whole hemisphere, then you go with those countries, you know, the coalitions of the willing idea. With Mexico, clearly, I actually like a lot what Luis said, and you know, cooperation in terms of expanding our sales to Asia. I mean, it's in line with what I said actually before you came, that there really hasn't been a recognition of the kinds of restructuring that we have to go through, the United States, Mexico, etc. I mean, China can't keep having a current account surplus, and we can't keep having a deficit. That means China also has to start emphasizing developing its domestic market, and we also have to start exporting more. And I think you're right, there's a certain complementarity then in terms of being able, in cooperation with Mexico, accessing other markets, you know, in terms of selling to them. But I frankly, aside from Bush's personality and the Iraq War, now those are 2 big asides, I understand that. But frankly, the goals, I mean, I think it's a mistake for the United States to stop talking about democracy. And frankly, if Latin America were governed by military regimes, you know, and we had a president who said we don't care about democracy, which has happened in the past, you know, that was not good. Latin America has been the most democratic region of the developing world, and I don't think it's an accident. Some things are the result of policy, and some of it is not. So trade, democracy, harmonization of rules to facilitate more economic integration, and then all the other things that everyone else mentioned. I mean, education. I would assume that a lot of us are up here because we went to school on scholarships. I mean, it was another day and age. We all had scholarships. And so I don't think there were new things under the sun. And cooperation on energy. And here I think we should take the lead of Brazil. I mean, Brazil is a country that has really kept an open mind, been somewhat ahead of the curve, you know, was developing hydro, was developing oil, was developing ethanol, was developing whatever so that it wasn't a sitting duck, you know, depending on one thing. So there's a lot of expertise in Latin America also. What's been missing was, I think, real working together. Maybe it's a hemispheric task force. Now, it makes it real hard when you have the hemisphere fragmented the way it is. I mean, you got the problem of a bunch of foxes in the chicken coop, and we're going to have to decide whether we always have to bring everyone in, or if you just bring in people who want, you know, who share a certain kind of vision of the kind of future they'd like to have that is congruent enough and a direction to go. I mean, I leave that to everybody else, but I don't think it's a mystery if I listen to all, you know, having listened to all the panels and having looked at the kind of policy toward the Americas that we've been following, you know, at least since Jimmy Carter. It's been a bipartisan kind of policy with some changes here and there. But it has to restructure, given that we can't go back to where we were before the end of last year. I mean, we can't do it, and we can't consume our way out of this recession.
Very briefly, Peter, because we're out of time.
Susan, I have to disagree.
You've been disagreeing with me for years, and vice versa.
What else is new?
This administration has been in office a little over 100 days. The lack of a clear policy toward Latin America goes back at least to after 9/11. And to say that this administration is unconcerned with democracy because it maybe is opening you know, a little bit of discussion with Cuba, going back to some stuff that existed before.
Yes, that was not
well,
the focus.
Well, I don't see the evidence that it's unconcerned with political democracy. In fact, the discussions about Venezuela, if anything, have been very hard-edged. I actually agree that Venezuela has taken a very authoritarian direction, but I don't see any evidence that this administration is unconcerned with political democracy. And I think it's that the slackness of the definition of a policy toward Latin America goes back at least to the first Bush administration, and that it simply hasn't been fully corrected yet or adjusted or defined. I think we have to give this administration a little bit of slack, because I think the phrase someone used was, there are distractions elsewhere in the world.
There always are.
That, Susan.
There are.
I know, but these are larger scale distractions. I don't think it's fair to characterize this administration the way you have on the basis of the evidence so far.
Sydney, wrap it up real quick.
I'm not going to wrap it up. I wanted to ask Peter a question, because I don't understand your logic fully on the drug issue, or call it governance issue, whatever you want to call it. Give it whatever label you want. Why can't all of the education you're talking about and all of the emphasis on remedial kinds of treatment and all of the rest of that, why can't that go together with legalization? Why does it have to be only the declaration of the two countries they're going to cut back? You have no assurance that it's going to be reduced. We're spending a fortune now. Legalization won't be accepted now, but for every drug. Could be for marijuana. Right. Then in that case, Mexico doesn't have to do a damn thing, because if the money is taken out of it at this end, then all of Mexico's problems become manageable. As long as the money is there, Mexico's problems are really impossible.
Very brief reaction, Peter, please.
So I just don't understand all of your reasoning, using a flimsy, rather essentially argument that we can cut back in some reasonable time the amount of drug use, despite the fact that it's been going up. The price we can always determine through taxation, the way we do for other kinds of imports. Otherwise, I haven't understood why you dismissed the critical element in order to get to your point.
Real quick, please, because Andrew is ready to wrap up.
Well, let me tell you what I would do personally if I were the drug czar. I would legalize marijuana tomorrow. That's about 3/4 of the drug consumption in this country. I would not legalize cocaine.
You need legislation.
Hmm?
You need legislation.
I'm sorry.
You need legislation
Legislation.
to do that. You need legislation to legalize it.
Yeah, all right. But I was the czar. I thought I made myself the czar. But of course, to me, the most enlightened policy would, in fact, take away the legal restrictions on marijuana. But I would not remove them from other hard drugs, which are much of the, they're the most expensive drugs. They're the ones that drive a lot of the traffic. They're the ones that create the greatest public havoc. So I'm just saying, I would not do that. What you would get if you had a regime that removed the legal restrictions on marijuana is that you would be able to focus and say tax that consumption. You'd have funds to focus on reduction of demand through these other means of really hard drugs, which are much harder. It's much harder to do, but it's possible. The research shows it's possible. The research shows that if you had a sustained policy, you could do it. So I don't think it. Now, my personal view would be yes, I would do that with marijuana. I think politically it would be difficult to do, and you might not want me as a czar, but nonetheless, I still believe it is. The research shows you can reduce demand. We've done it with cigarettes. There's a sign, big billboard outside of L.A. When used as directed, cigarettes kill. That kind of campaign really makes an effect. Tobacco consumption has been changed. Now, there are pockets of growth, especially among young women in the United States, but you can really affect that. So I don't think it's. I don't think straight legalization of. The question is how you're going to do it.
Nobody ever.
Okay. Sorry, but we're out of time.
Okay, sorry.
And Andrew promised to close this whole conference on a very positive note.
On a very positive note.
Yes,
wow. Well, though this has been, I will close on a positive note, not because we are reaching positive conclusions, but because it's been such a thought-provoking afternoon. I want to thank all of our panelists for participating in this discussion.